Hello, everyone. Today I have a very special show, and it's a little bit different from my typical live shows. But I'm kind of hoping, honestly, that my live shows can kind of go in a similar direction in the future. We'll see how well it goes. So, welcome, everyone. Today we're doing some readings from the Jewish Book of Horror, which I have right here. It's an anthology full of horror stories written in the Jewish mythology. It's a very good anthology. Some really interesting stories in here. So I have three wonderful authors from this anthology, and they're all going to do a reading from their story. And so I thought we would introduce the authors first, and we're going to start with Brenda.
Hi. Of course, I'm part of the Denver Horror Collective. It's been a wonderful group for me as a writer. I also belong to the Horror Writers Association and have some stuff in different anthologies. Recently had some poetry come out in the Horror Writers Association's poetry showcase. And I have a book that's open for pre-order now through Raw Dog Screaming Press. It's going to be my collection of stories that are all interconnected about my creepy valley, wonderful, haunted, beautiful valley I live in. And that's for pre-order now. And and then I submitted a story for this and got into that. Yeah, I think that's pretty much me.
All right. Elana, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm a member of Denver Horror Collective, but I don't live in Denver, which is kind of typical for me because I was born in a country that no longer exists. And now part of this country is bombing the city of my birth, from which you can gather I was born in the USSR. We left when I was very young. I was born in Kiev. I spent a lot of time in Israel. I lived in Italy and in London and even in Hong Kong for a while. And now I live in California. Um, I'm an academic, actually. I'm a professor of English literature. And for a very long time, I published books and articles about horror and about science fiction. And only about 12 years ago, I decided it was time for me to start writing horror and science fiction. And so I did. So I published by now 4 novels and several collections and a number of stories. And Jewish Book of Horror, my story in it is based on the experience of my family. So it has a real historical foundation. And I have 2 novels coming out pretty soon. And that's about it. And everything else, is in the story itself. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Daniel's been on the show before. How about you introduce yourself too, Daniel?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back, and thanks for hosting us, Jason.
Of course.
So I'm Daniel Braum. I have a story, as Jason said, in the Jewish Book of Horror, which was published, as you heard Elana and Brenda mention, they're in the Denver Horror Collective. So the Denver Horror Collective is the publisher of the Jewish Book of Horror, and it's edited by one of its members and founders or drivers, Josh Schlossberg. So we're all excited to be part of it. I'm excited. It was great working with Josh. He did a great job putting together this project. Putting together the book. About me, I'm a writer of mostly short stories. My collections are called The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales from Cemetery Dance. The Wish Mechanics, Stories of the Strange and Fantastic. That's from Italian publisher Independent Legions. And my most recent book is called Underworld Dreams. That's from Dim Shores Press. And I think Jason and I, we've talked about several of those books and stories. most of my stories, I like to use the term strange tales, which I borrowed, adopted, co-opted from Robert Aikman. Although some of the stories you might call them Jewish horror, like they usually don't seem to go head on, but there are a few stories that deal with Jewish culture, history, or folklore, or it's there tangentially. And yeah, I'm also the host of a reading series called Nighttime Logic and a yearly festival called the New York Ghost Story Festival. So it's really great to be here, Jason.
Well, thank you all for coming. So we're here to talk about, not just talk about this book. We're going to talk about it a little bit. It's mostly going to be some readings, and that's the Jewish Book of Horror. I had some questions about how this book came to be. The anthology is edited by Josh Schlossberg, like Daniel mentioned, and it had the backing. I guess maybe the original idea for this came from the Jewish Horror Authors Facebook group and the Denver Horror Collective, which the latter of which was already mentioned. How exactly? What was the germination of this book, and how did it come into its existence? Anyone can take this. Brenda?
At the time I was on the steering committee for the Denver Horror Collective when Josh brought this forth, and it just seemed like a really powerful idea. A lot of the stories that are out there now are, I guess there just isn't enough. There wasn't enough representation. And so that was one thing that was, I would say, in Josh's heart when he brought forth this idea. And I know it was a labor of love for him. A lot of other members, he had other like readers that were going through and picking out the stories. And then, of course, going through the editing process and everything. It's been really well received. So he can be very proud of that. We can be very proud of that. But hopefully it opens up, because I think everything in this book has, some roots in folklore and stories that have been told for a long time, and now we're able to kind of bring them out for everyone. Elana might be able to say more about that too.
Yeah. Well, actually, as I said, I'm a professor. So, like about 15 years ago, I wrote an essay called "The Man from the Yellow Star," in which I tried to explain why so little Jewish speculative fiction is being written, considering, there are many Jewish science fiction horror writers, Isaac Asimov, whatever, and yet there is so little actually Jewish speculative fiction. And I also don't like to use words horror or science fiction because, there is this umbrella, as you said, strange tales. So I wrote this essay and it got some, backlash. And then I thought, okay, fine. If so little Jewish speculative fiction is being written, maybe I should write some myself. And so I was really happy to see this call for submissions. When I saw it, I said, it's a fabulous idea. And I wrote my story. And one of the novels, as I said, I have two novels coming out. One is called Girl of Light, and it's indirectly connected to the story in the Jewish Book of Horror. But I just found that Jewish history is so amazing and so strange and so kind of fantastic as it is, but also so horrible, that it should give rise to a whole library of speculative fiction. And I think Jewish Book of Horror fills this lacuna, this niche, which really very much needs to be filled.
Yeah, you said something interesting there, that Jewish mythology can be very strange and very dark. I honestly had no idea about that until I started reading the stories in here, and I was like, "Wow, this is some very deep and disturbing stuff in here that, you know, as a non-Jewish person myself, I was completely ignorant of. I think a lot of non-Jewish people would really benefit from reading this.
Yeah, even a Jewish person. I'm not a very observant Jewish person, but yeah, even a Jewish person like myself, it's easy to miss the horror element as we think of it, or miss the speculative fiction. I think representation is really important, and I'm really interested to hear and look up Elana's essay on that. Like, one of the only Jewish authors that you can say is close to it that at least I'd been exposed to was an author called Isaac Bashevis Singer, who is quite known, but isn't so much known for his horror or spec fiction. But he's got them. They're there, and they're dark, and they're really strange. So yeah, I definitely would recommend. The author Jeffrey Ford gave me a list that I'm working on building on, of just getting a list of some Bashevis Singer stories out there, which is it's a good entry point. Josh's book, The Jewish Book of Horror, is also another great entry point, because not only is there a lack of representation, sometimes there's outright hostility. And I've been submitting stories for a decade or two, and it's rare, but I've gotten responses from editors that you might know that love this story. I'm not going to publish it. It's too Jewish. So it's like, okay, yeah, it's your publication. You can do that. But so that's why I too was really excited to see the call for submissions, and I'm even more excited that Denver Horror Collective decided to run with Josh's idea, and that Josh put it out there.
Do you guys find that maybe times are changing at all? That maybe there is now more of a thirst for knowledge within the horror genre for more Jewish type stories?
Yes, I definitely think so. There have been attempts before, but as the horror field is becoming more international and more diverse in all kinds of ways, so definitely Jewish voices come to the fore. And the whole issue, it's a very interesting and complex issue, because after all, what is Jewish horror? Who is the Jew to begin with? Like, I'm non-observant at all, and yet I'm Jewish. Like, my foundation of my story and my interest in Jewish speculative fiction is history, not so much religion as such. And history also includes folklore and mythology and so on. But so my general sense is absolutely yes. There is so much more interest today, simply because there is more interest in, non-mainstream Anglo-American, whatever you want to call it, trend in horror and speculative fiction in general. So yeah, the answer is yes.
I'd love to see that interest translate over to more projects. I'd love to think that there's more interest. I honestly just don't know. I know there have been some champions of Jewish speculative fiction, but I don't see projects that translating into projects. There's an author and an editor, Jack Dan. He's a New Yorker who's now in Australia, that put out a book called Wandering Stars and some sequels. Yeah. A couple other projects. There was another Jewish speculative fiction book. I'm not sure if it got off the ground. I know. So it's great. It's great. It'd be great to see more projects. I'm really intrigued of the topic that Elana mentioned. What is Jewish horror? I mean, I think it's fun that maybe there isn't an answer, or it's great that the answer can be different for everyone. I think it's great that in this book, we see, at least from what is a Jewish author, we see stories from people who are not Jewish. We see people from stories who are religious. We see people who maybe are culturally Jewish but not practicing. So I think, at least for Jewish authors, there's some great representation in the book. But yeah, I think even with 22 stories, right, it might be hard to get your arms around just at least just what Jewish horror could potentially encompass, which is a great thing.
Did you want to add anything to that, Brenda?
I just think that the idea of Jewish horror, just like a lot of othered groups of people, are coming more to the forefront. And so we're seeing space being made for things like Jewish horror or queer horror or POC horror. You know, there's just a lot more. There's space being made, and I want to see it continue to keep on heading in that direction, because it's been dominated by privileged writers for all too long, and it would be nice to see a lot more liberated spaces for people to be able to share stories that need to be spoken and written and read.
For sure. Michael, who I believe is actually in this anthology as well. He's in the comments, and he asks Elena if her essay is available online.
Oh, definitely. And afterwards, I can post it in chat. There are links to the essay, and there have been several academic books about the whole issue of Jewish horror and Jewish speculative literature. And actually, I'm working on editing an anthology of essays on this very subject,
Yeah.
which will debate, the issue of what Jewish horror is and how many different kinds, because there are many different kinds of Jews as well, and many different voices in Jewish culture. And this is what makes it so interesting and so exciting.
You can, if you want, you can send me the link to that essay in either Messenger, or you can email it to me, and I'll put it in the show notes, so it's like right there. Or you can just comment it in the comments too. That'll work. As I was saying before, and it was brushed upon in our discussion here, that Jewish horror, the first question is, what is Jewish horror? I don't think there's an answer to that. It's almost like saying what's, you could ask that of almost any genre. But I want to know why Jewish representation isn't very strong within horror, or in fact, very much of mainstream entertainment, honestly, because it's not like there's a very small amount of Jewish people in the world. There's a lot. So why isn't there more representation?
May I? I think there is a lot of representation, but a lot of it is kind of disguised. Unfortunately, for a very long time, Jews were, as Brenda put it, the other, the monster, the thing in the closet, the one that cannot be named. Anti-Semitism has been part of Western culture just forever. And so Jews do exist, like, even if you think about Lovecraft, a lot of his monstrosities are disguised representations of Jews and other racial minorities. So Jews have always existed, but as the other, not the one who speaks, but the one who is spoken about. And it's changing now, and that's a wonderful thing. There have always been Jews in horror, but not necessarily where we would like to be.
I know this is a literature discussion, but at least in it's closely related to the indie filmmaking. I know there's been two small indie films that have had that kind of when I say positive representation, Elana puts it really well. Representation in terms of, okay, this is what it's like. These are their stories. One of them, the most recent one, is called The Vigil, and the others, and that was, I think, from 2020, perhaps 2021, and the other was called The Demon, and that was from 2015. So yeah, it's great. I'm definitely seeing motion in that direction.
Yeah, there's also a movie called The Possession, I think it was 2018. I'm not sure, around there.
Mm.
Which is like a possession story, but with a Jewish angle, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that seems to be the one that seems to be coming up. Both the Demon and the Vigil do have, keep it spoiler free, do have those possession angles. In just putting books out there that have, there's a book, I believe it's called 3 Days to Never, and maybe it was within the last 10 years. It's by a prominent author who is not Jewish, but his name is Tim Powers, and yeah, he does a wonderful job of both giving a speculative twist to the notion of the Dybbuk and also a notion in Jewish history that I won't say for spoiler reasons. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's great to see it when it comes across.
All right. So I was just wondering, before we get into the readings, if anyone has any maybe recommendations of a writer or two who you would recommend anyone looking to branch out and maybe read more Jewish. It doesn't have to be horror, but a horror slant is fine. But Jewish literature.
There is a very interesting writer, Levi Tidhar. He is an Israeli British writer. He was born in Israel. He lives in the UK. He writes in English, and he's very difficult to classify. It's sort of dark fantasy, horror, science fiction. He's very interesting. Some of his novels deal with the Holocaust in the 20th century. So highly recommend it.
Yeah, I guess I've been throwing what few recommendations I know out there. Isaac Bashevis Singer, Jack, some of Jack Dan's work, and yeah, the Jewish Book of Horror itself can serve as a gateway. I'm sure you could pick any writer in that book and go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole.
It's the gateway drug. Brenda, do you have any?
I think when you're thinking about this, go back and revisit Kafka, because a lot of people don't realize that he was a Jewish author. I highly recommend anything that's written by Josh Schlossberg, the editor. He wrote Maline. He actually won the Horror Writers Guild award for this year on that book. And then I think he actually has another book that's going to be coming out soon. I won't name it, but he has one and it's very good. I've kind of been beta reading it. And then actually just look at the table of contents in this beautiful book, because a lot of these people have books out there that, they're pretty prolific, and get out there and start just going through the list,
Awesome.
And of course, I highly recommend Daniel and Elana, because they just have some really wonderful books out there that will just blow your mind.
There's 3 right here that are awesome. All right, so as I said, we're going to start with Brenda in the readings here. You mentioned earlier, Brenda, that you have a collection of stories coming out, I believe in June, was it?
Yeah, we're saying June-ish. We're not totally sure, but they launched the cover and started pre-orders now, and that's through Raw Dog Screaming Press, and it's Blood Mountain.
And is this your first collection, or even like release of?
Yeah, it would be my first collection of stories that I'm putting out there. They're kind of if you've ever read Steinbeck's Pastures of Heaven, it's kind of like that. They're separate stories, but they're all interconnected.
Very cool.
To the place and the mountains here and everything. So I'm very excited for it to come out. It actually was my master's thesis, so it feels really good to see it out there in the world.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that, especially after reading your story in Jewish Book of Horror. Your story in Jewish Book of Horror has an interesting a title. I'm going to try to pronounce it. It's Ba'alat of, I believe.
Pretty
I hope
much, yeah. Yeah.
I hope I got that right. Now, can you tell us just a little bit of what it's about before you get into the reading?
So when you read this story, so it's the Witch of Endor, essentially. When Saul went, it was actually the night before he dies, and he goes and he had already put to death or got rid of most of the witches, the necromancers, prior to that on order of his god. And so he is coming and he's trying to find someone who will bring forth Samuel, or I think it's Shamuel is the Hebrew name for Samuel. And he wants Samuel, who is always his guiding force, his figure that told him what to do and what not to do early in his reign. He's looking for his spirit to tell him what to do as he's, going to go into battle. And I've always found this story very remarkable, and that the pivoting, important figure is the witch herself, and she is not really given a voice. The voice of a man comes through her. Saul has so much to do with the story, but you don't really hear her experience, and how frightening that must have been to have someone who had been, putting to death your people, and having this king, coming to find you. So that's, I guess you would say I kind of went with a feminist reimagining of the story, and attempting in it my attempt to give her more of a voice and to understand her power or her gift, however you look at it.
All right, so I'm gonna pull you up on the screen here,
Okay.
and you can do your reading.
All right.
Here we go. Just gotta make sure I don't hit that remove from stream. It's like so close to it. You think they'd separate them? All right, there we go.
Okay. So I'm going to read from Ba'alat, and I'll start it now. In the night, the spirits spoke with hisses and gurgles like serpents wrapped around my head. I awoke covered in sweat, barely able to breathe, so afraid of what they would ask me to do. They whispered things over and over, crying out for understanding. There was never a choice in my action, only the act itself, or madness. The gift of the Ishe Balat Av was taboo, but if not sent by Elohim, then who? What other power could overtake a child in such a way? My grandmother said it was the power from Asherah, the lady of the Serpent. She told me this, forbidding me from saying the name out loud. Women were killed for less, and for us, death came slow, behind brick or below the soil. We were not magicians or conjurers, but unwitting necromancers with the ancient connection to the dead. They came pressing into our dreams at night with leathery bodies and wet tongues, speaking terrible truths mixed with lies. Through learning and practice, we understood discernment, but this took many years. Sometimes the spirits of the dead kept us plunged deep in Sheol, neglecting our physical bodies. Eventually, we would awake starved, crawling with insects, our mouths full of teeth and stone. It was always the same. When we reached for nourishment, a bit of bread, a mouthful of water, they might leave us to recover, sensing, I suppose, our uselessness in death. They did not leave us for long, descending once more, filling our mouths until we opened our bodies wide, allowing them to push into us. The visions and words flowed like a river of thought, disjointed and disturbing. Sometimes the meaning escaped us, and the spirits grew irritable and angry. Other times they touched our mind like feathers. If ignored, they filled our mouths with stones and teeth and berries, symbolizing their intruding thoughts and displeasure. We could not deny them when they did this, or they would replicate the objects until we choked. I have only observed it once in a child who did not know her gift. She was found with her purple cheeks stuffed, bumpy with rocks and berries, oozing down her chin mixed with blood. The child did not know how to open herself. We had no choice but to obey. I was blessed to have a teacher in my grandmother. Even after the day our kind were silenced on threat of death, the king did not understand that the gift could not be silenced or stopped. We did not call it down by dark means. It was imbued, a conception, a heritage that could not be refused. Though we hid far above the towns we served, they still hunted us to near extinction. My grandmother took us deep into the highlands, continuing my education, but the king's men were jackals on a blood trail. They knew we knew they would eventually find us. On this last day, I watched hidden as they shut my grandmother behind brick and rock, the men sitting in grim vigil until her scratching and screaming ceased. After they left, I waited, frightened to approach our home that sat empty and tomb-like. I tried to pull the bricks down, but one layer over another revealed another. I sat for many days as the spirit spoke of her death, slowly cut off from light and then air. Beyond that wall I could not hear my grandmother, though I slept beside it for many days. For 2 years the spirits remained quiet, as if they also feared the command of the king, and I lived feral in my grief and the silence of this loss of connection. Until the night the spirits returned. In my dreams I heard the first whisper beyond the wall, the sound crossing between the worlds. I listened to her voice, angry and harsh within the sudden whirlwind of insect-like voices of the spirits. I awoke, my mouth forced open with gravel and berries, and I jammed my fingers behind the rocks, pushing them out so I could fill my lungs with air. Beyond, the voice filtered from the wall in its terrible words. I recognized that voice. Deep within my bones, I knew. My dreams continued for many days, vivid, awash in meat and blood. Men screaming as a horde of bronze washed over them with no end. This horde of thousands moved in iridescent swarms that entered every opening, funneling into the nose, mouth, eyes, and nether regions. I heard their clicking mandibles chewing through the bodies of men, their mouths so full of the horde that they couldn't scream. The men tore their clothing and skin in agony, crawling toward me, grasping the hem of my robe. The terrible cacophony would merge into my mouth, screaming my eyes open. My body and face pressed upon the cool bricks, my breath the only sound after the terrible din of the dream. I closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet that blanketed my mind, seeking another sound altogether. I waited until I heard the scratching of nails, a terrible sound, yet a promise that she was also there with me. Sometimes during the day they would come pushing into the corners of my mind. He will come, and you will tell, they hissed, rolling a stone into my mouth. Clutching my head, I asked, who will come? He will come, and another will come through, they whispered, adding a berry with another stone. What shall I do? I pleaded, digging my fingers into my temples, seeking to dull the pain. I spat stones and juice, trying hard not to swallow. You will feed him. They laughed before vacating. I saw them 3 days later down the valley, long before finding my cave. I watched the dusty caravan creeping closer. Servants darted out to explore the many caverns below, looking for the Balatov. The spirits were strangely hushed with their coming. I washed my body and anointed myself in precious oils. My hair I let fall to my waist in long dark curls. I remained a pure oracle, untouched by man, only invaded by spirits, a conduit of the unseen. We could copulate, but only to produce the next daughter. If sons were created, the spirits would come into the night and slip into our bellies. They would feed there for many days, ripping apart the child with tiny sharp teeth, until only blood poured out from the womb. The woman would share in the agony, our spirit in direct union with our young. This was the reason there were so few of us. We did not want to chance the sorrow of growing a son. I lived with many rules of purity. The laws of the Balatov were not so different from any oracle. Our body is treated as a sacred space. We relied on the people seeking our power to provide. The people of Endor would climb to this cave, bringing food and textiles and trade for words from the dead. They also brought news, especially of the king's men, who hunted the Balatov by command of Elohim. Yet magic is only magic when pouring out of a woman's mouth. When I was ready, I left the cave and climbed the high ridge. I felt the heavy presence of the spirits around me, but they hovered just out of reach. I started a fire, feeding it with wood until it could easily be seen by those below. I wanted the man to know I expected him. I walked barefoot to the edge, my eyes sweeping the dun earth. The hills of Moria fell away to my left and Mount Tabor to my right. I stood in a nameless place, high above Endor, with the Jezreel Valley cups hand below. The caravan paused, and a man rode to the front. I could not see who he was, but my mouth began to filling with small stones like smooth teeth. I knew he was the one the spirit spoke of. I turned those stones with my tongue, retreating to the fire, spitting them into the flames. I won't deny you. I did not know if I spoke to the spirits or the man. I watched the man consult with his armored column, the metal shining under the dwindling sunlight. Thousands of lights flickered in the valley to the southwest, a vast army waiting for battle. I sensed they were in opposition to the man who parted from the caravan. Alone, he rode to the base of the ridge, glancing up, perhaps noting the smoke of my fire. All around, the air circulated in ropes of warmth and ice. Hushed whispers flowed, ancient voices in sing-song. Their words were dark and terrible, melting my knees and making my hands tremble. Something foreboding followed in the wake of the man. Thank you. I think you're on mute.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Elana, and you're in checking out the authors and you. In regards to this, I noticed that you have a novella out right now and a full length novel, and I bought both of them. The most recent is Little Sister. It was released in October of 2021 by Crystal Lake Publishing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brenda, for the wonderful reading. So, yes, Little Sister is absolutely connected to the story I'm about to read from. As I thought, my connection to Jewishness comes by history, not by religion. A little history, and I was born in the USSR, where my grandparents, both of them, were devout communists, and my grandfather, in fact, died at the age of 23 defending Kiev from the Nazis. Not obviously, I never saw him. He never saw his daughter, my mother. She was born after his death. So this is history, and Little Sister is a fantastic reimagining of the USSR, because it was a fantastic country in so many ways and a horrible country. So I thought, when I was writing it, I thought, why there are so many horror novels based on the Third Reich, on Nazism, and so few trying to reimagine or to understand what the USSR was like. And I think, unfortunately, the whole issue has become very topical recently. It wasn't, I wasn't thinking about it when I was writing it.
Yeah.
So this is what Little Sister is. It's a sort of dark fantasy reimagining of the USSR in the darkest moment of its history, which was a war, what they call the Great Patriotic War, the war with Nazi Germany. And there is a novel coming out soon enough, I hope in October, called Girl of Light, which again is a sort of expansion of Little Sister. As for the story I'm about to read, it's based on my family history. It starts with a young woman coming back in 1945 when the war is over. She's coming back to the birthplace, and when she goes to her home and asks where is the Jewish family that used to live there, she's told there have never been any Jews here. And this is what happened to my grandmother. When she came back home to the place where she was born, it used to be a small Jewish township. It had 20,000 Jews. When she came back, not a single one was left alive. They were all buried in a mass grave. So this is what the story is. It begins with this event, which, as I thought, it really did happen to my grandmother, and it proceeds with, I gave it a fantastic twist, a twist of horror, but I think the history of the Jews in the USSR, in Eastern Europe, is fantastic enough as it is. So the most horrible element in the story is not a monster.
I found your story to be a bit of a gut punch, mostly because of the mother and child aspect to it. So I'm gonna put you on the solo screen here, and we'll get to your reading.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm starting from towards the end, actually. So they thought the protagonist, whose name is Rosa, she comes back. Her entire family was slaughtered, but she's told that her baby survived because he was given to a Ukrainian woman. So she comes in to get her son back. Rosa had imagined Oksana to be a decrepit, hunched-over creature, but she was tall, straight, and stout. Her traditional black and red embroidered blouse strained against her broad shoulders. Her shovel-like hands were bigger than most men's. If it were not for the fact that the thick braids wound around her head were white, Rosa might have doubted her age or even her gender. The woman's face was impassive, but her eyes seemed infected, whipping clear liquid down her seamy cheeks. "What do you want?" the woman barked. "I want my son," Rosa replied. She was done with the pretense that Sasha was her baby brother. She was going to rip this ogre to shreds if necessary to recover him. The red eyes stared at her impassively. Rosa noticed with a shiver of disgust that they blinked independently of each other. "A Jewess, are you?" Oksana smirked. "Where is my son, you witch?" Rosa shouted and tried to push past the woman. She might have just as well tried to move a granite boulder. Mama! A child's piping voice from inside the cottage. With a desperate shove, Rosa barged through the door and found herself in the dim, windowless hall cluttered with tools. She stumbled over a hole and almost fell with the inner door open, letting in daylight. A child was standing in the entryway, staring at her with big, dark eyes. When she had let herself think of Sasha during the war, which was not often, she had remembered that helpless, mewling bundle in her arms, his scrunched-up pink face, a jumble of unformed features. But this boy was 4 years old and big for his age. He seemed well cared for. His black curly hair was clean, his clothes old but carefully mended. And he did not have the haunted, feral expression Rosa had seen in the faces of war children grabbing in the ruins or sitting mutely by the corpses of their parents. But he was apprehensive, backing away from Rosa when she lunged toward him. Sasha! He ran into the inner room. You're scaring him, Jewess. Oksana Graf's voice sounded behind her. And his name is Kola, Nikolai. Rosa whirled around in a rage, her teeth bared. The old woman's face seemed to mirror her expression until Rosa realized it was meant to be a smile. Come on, come on, Oksana motioned her in. Let's sit together and discuss it calmly. Break bread and salt with me. Rosa forced herself to inhale and exhale. Combat had taught her that berserkers died first. Keeping a cool head was a key to victory. She followed Oksana in. As was traditional in peasant dwellings, the cottage was divided into 2 large rooms. The outer room, called Gornitsa, was where guests were entertained and everyday business of living was conducted. It was clean and well kept, belying the cottage's dilapidated exterior. The earthen floor was swept, the long table covered with an embroidered cloth. But Rosa was surprised to find no decorations. Most people would keep either an icon of the Virgin or portraits of Lenin and Stalin in the Gornitsa, often both. Her mother had had a red banner and a Passover tray, which she never used. But this room was bare. Oksana motioned Rosa to sit down and busied herself with a large pot-bellied samovar making tea. Rosa could not understand the sudden change from hostility to hospitality. The woman was even offering her bread and salt, which meant she was an honored guest rather than an unwanted intruder. She was straining to hear the boy's voice from the inner room, but all was quiet. Was he frightened of her? But how could that be when his face was a miniature copy of her own? Black eyes, black hair, full lips, a living portrait of her family. Oksana poured steaming tea into 2 glasses and placed a fresh loaf of bread and a salt cellar into a tray. Rosa had no appetite, but not to partake would be a deadly insult, and she realized she needed to come to an agreement with the woman. If she went to the authorities, Oksana could simply claim the child was her own, and who would accept a Jew's word against hers? Is he hungry? Rosa asked, trying to soften her voice. Maybe he also wants some bread. She was sure Oksana would refuse, which would confirm her opinion that she was an unfit caregiver. But Oksana nodded and, taking a slice, went over to the inner room, calling the boy by the name that was not his, Kola. He peeked out. His eyes lit up when he saw Oksana, but he cast a single timid glance toward Rosa. She recognized his expression, the fear of a furtive, hunted animal. The dam that had kept Rosa's eyes dry for 4 years burst. Her tears rained on the bread. Embarrassed, she quickly wiped her eyes and, to disguise the dampness on the loaf, liberally sprinkled it with salt. Oksana came back and noisily slurped her tea. She tore off a chunk of bread and shoved it into her mouth. And as she bit down, she changed. The transformation was both slow enough to convince Rosa she was not losing her mind and fast enough to flow by in a stream of fluid impossibilities. The embroidered blouse disappeared, absorbed into the rapidly expanding torso. The braids floated away in a puff of white smoke. The face migrated to the top of the blank, cauldron-like head that now sat on the sloping shoulders without the benefit of a neck. The wiry arms lengthened until the taloned hands brushed the floor, and then the creature stood up. Below its hanging belly, a giant bird's fleshy stilts, covered with scabby scales, twitched and scrambled. Balanced on enormous chicken's legs, the upper torso, both simian and human, bent toward Rosa as the creature regarded her with its weeping, bloodshot eyes. Rosa's mind did not go blank. Instead, she found herself embracing the crystal clarity of combat, where everything was possible and nothing was benign. Astri, she said, the demon nurse. The incongruously tiny face on top of the monstrous head tittered. So, you remember your stories after all, Rosa, daughter of Esther, daughter of Rivka. I do. You have to have a little bread and salt every day to maintain your human disguise. But a mother's tears are mightier than bread and saltier than salt. They wash away all falsehood and reveal you for what you are. True, the Astri said. But consider that I saved your son. He was going to be thrown into the same hole where your mother and sisters are rotting, unremembered and unmourned, because the people who put him there were their friends and neighbors. Not true. It was the fascists, the Fritzes, the invaders. And would they be able to kill millions if they did not have help? Rosa looked away. Where are your demons? The Astri went on. But we're in hiding, just as you are. If all Jews are hunted down, there will be no Jewish demons left. We both wear a disguise in order to survive. You have your uniform. I have my bread and salt. Rosa lifted her head, looking without fear into the face of her childhood nightmare. Is it true that you're drinking my son's life? The Astri smirked. If I did, he would be dead by now. No, Rosa, daughter of Esther. We need young blood to survive, just as you do. I took him to raise as my own. But now that you have seen my true face, I have no power over him anymore. You can take him. He is yours. He is yours. Yours to grow up hearing the ugly words that were thrown at Rosa in the schoolyard. Yours to mingle with the children of his family's murderers. Yours to strive to prove with every breath that he is loyal, only to be accused of disloyalty at the end. Yours to scrutinize his face in the mirror, agonizing over his stubbornly Jewish cast of his features. Yours to live in the world that hates his very existence. The creature's weeping eyes met her own. What would happen to him if he stayed with you? Rosa asked. He would become like me, a demon, immortal as long as our people live, disguised as human, but not human, tasting bread and salt to disappear among the multitudes, taking the breath of our haters, stealing their lives and their children's lives in revenge for what they have done to us. But he will survive. Yes, demons cannot be killed. Take him, Rosa said. Take my son. Thank you.
All right. That was Bread and Salt from the Jewish Book of Horror. Thank you very much. That was awesome. I really enjoyed that story. Actually, I enjoyed all the stories I've read in this anthology, but Daniel's was really interesting as well. One thing I really enjoyed about your story, Daniel, is that you managed to work in Terminator 2 into your story. That made it really That story, that movie has a really strong presence in my own past. I saw it at the drive-in theater when I was a kid, and I, seeing it, I had no idea it was coming in your story. Can you tell us a little bit about your story, Dan? Oh, hang on there, Dan. You're still on mute.
Okay.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't. I'm off mute now. You can hear me.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was hearing myself. I wasn't sure. Well, yeah. I'll try to keep it as spoiler free as possible because it's the sort of story that that might lend itself to spoilers. But yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. I'm going to read just a small bit of the story. It sort of the story folds into two halves. The first half of the story has a repeating structure. It's the same scene that were showed over again a few times. And the second half of the story is sort of the answer to that mystery. To answer your question, Jason, the working title of the story, while I was writing it, I initially called it the Determinator. So I very much had the movie The Terminator in mind, and I guess that's a spoiler in that even though it's not going to come into play in the bit I'm going to read, there are other tropes of horror, science fiction, and fantasy that were on my mind when writing it, and I do like to play with deconstructing those tropes or asking questions about those tropes, and even seeing, in this case, how some of those tropes could come into play with some Jewish notions. And of course, when we're talking about the Terminator, one of the notions we're talking about are notions of time travel. So in the story there is a different method of time travel that does come into play. I think that's what you're talking about. In addition to, the story takes place in the 80s. The main character very much sees the world through the lens of the 1980s and 1980s movies. He's talking about the Terminator with his father. He's thinking about Zaxxon and Pac-Man and pizza places and MTV videos. So it's very much starts in a very specific place and time.
And also, you say you like writing strange fiction, and this one definitely goes into the strange. So I'm going to put you up on the solo here, and you can go ahead and do your reading. All right, there you go.
Thanks. Yeah. Before I start reading, I just want to say I really enjoyed hearing Brenda and Elana read. That was great to hear their stories and their voice. And want to thank. I see that Michael is in, another Jewish Book of Horror colleague is in the comments. So thank you for Michael to coming, and thank you to our other friends and colleagues. Like I said, I'm going to read. This is a bit from the first half of the story. It's a short bit. But yeah, this is the last iteration of a scene. The first half of the story is a scene that repeats itself a few times. Why, that is a mystery. And the second half, it's sort of a big shift. But this is the last iteration of the first part of the story, which is called The Hand of Fire, and from the Jewish Book of Horror. And it takes place in the 1980s. It is a young American Jewish pre-teenager who is visiting Israel as a tourist, and you just have a sense of unease that his parents are not what they seem, and this child has not been raised in the way that you might think. So here's the excerpt from The Hand of Fire. Hot midday sun baked the tour bus. While his parents and the tour group milled around a table of trinkets, Jeffrey carefully inched toward the unimpressive pile of ancient stones that was the entrance to King Herod's tomb. The narrow entranceway, a gap between the gray blocks, was irresistible. A rope hung across it with a handwritten sign that read, "Keep out," in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. As he ducked under the rope, he felt an electric tingle on the back of his head, pushing him forward, pushing him to explore. He waited until his parents were preoccupied by the guy selling falafel and his photogenic camel. Then he slipped into the cool, damp darkness and hurried down the stairs. He stepped out of the square of sunlight from the entrance, ventured a few steps into the tomb, and halted. Dirty robes, bloody bandages, tin cans, and cigarette butts were strewn along the floor. A whiff of ozone lingered in the musty air. He held his nose and turned a corner, but he didn't want to go too far into the darkness of a room that once had dead people in it. Something rustled in the darkness. Was someone else down here? A stray dog, or another explorer, maybe? Hello? Jeffrey called. No one answered. A faint blue glow emanated from the corner of the chamber across from him. Jeffrey rubbed his eyes. As his vision began to adjust, he made out that the room was large and square and empty, except for the rubbish. Something moved. In the corner, a pile of rags and robes were moving. They rose from the floor and assembled into a tattered human shape. Take my hand. The voice came from the shape. Jeffrey thought he should be afraid, but found that he just wanted to watch. It ambled towards him. He couldn't make out a face, but saw the source of the blue glow was leaking from the dusty wrappings. You will be safe with me, it said. Jeffrey eyed the path to the stairs, but instead of bolting, stood transfixed. Ephraim Ben Moshe, please listen to me. He felt the surge of adrenaline, but still did not run. The thing reached out its hand and grabbed him. He knew he should struggle, but only focused on how his wrist felt so cold. Yes, it said. You remember I told you not to run. We've been down this path before so many times. I fear this may be the last. Come with me to the desert. The desert? What? Who are you? Why are you doing this? No, you have to remember, we're running out of time. You're going to die. Again, you need to listen. Jeffrey twisted his arm to break the man's grip. He gathered his breath to yell for help as blue light spilled from beneath the man's displaced wrappings. Jeffrey, are you down there? His father called. Something about the blue light was so familiar. Yes, please remember, it said. There isn't time. Jeffrey stopped struggling. He allowed the man to turn his palm down. Next time, you will remember everything. You must come with me. He traced on the back of Jeffrey's right hand with one bandaged finger. A glowing letter, a Hebrew letter, appeared there. Jeffrey's father called for him again. People were descending through the entrance. The robes and rags collapsed to the floor. The letter on Jeffrey's hand faded, then disappeared. Jeffrey's father stormed through the dark. Here, I'm over here, Dad. When we tell you to stay close. Dad, there was this. He wanted to say, there was a man dressed in rags who told me I was going to die. But he held his words. His father gently lifted him and touched his forehead with the back of his hand. You feel warm. Water. Get my son some water, he called. His dad slung Jeffrey's arm around his shoulder and helped him up the stairs. Looking back, Jeffrey saw what looked like a man hovering over the pile of rags. He was naked and appeared made of light, like one of those after images you see when you look at the sun. Glowing blue Hebrew letters danced over his body. Then the man disappeared, the light winked out with him, and the chamber returned to black. Jeffrey drank the Capri Sun juice pouch, even though he didn't want to. The silver bag was like an astronaut's drink, another fascinating thing they didn't have back home. He knew he should hydrate. He told himself that once the body feels thirst, it is already dehydrated, but didn't know where the thought came from, which disturbed him. His dad insisted he skip the rest of the day's activities. Thus, the tour bus had to go directly to their Jerusalem hotel, their next destination, to drop him off. Everyone else wasn't very happy about the turn of events. He didn't blame them. He still wanted to see more of the old sights. We never should have come, Moshe, Jeffrey's mom whispered. You knew this time would come when we took him in, Jeffrey's dad whispered back. The years passed so fast. He's not safe anymore, Rachel. Jeffrey wondered what they meant. The bus pulled into the lot in front of the hotel. It looked just like one in New York, only a lot less crowded, and there were palm trees. The lobby was populated by impeccably dressed staff of many ethnicities, attending to a group of priests in heavy robes and another group of somber old Jews in dark suits with long, curly strands of hair. A bellman approached and took their bags to the elevator on a shiny, gilded cart. The elevator was made of glass, and Jeffrey could see the mysterious buildings of the old city as he rose. He even glimpsed a big soccer stadium in the outskirts of the new city. The bellman wheeled the cart out of the elevator and led them to their room. He put the key, a strange plastic card, in the slot in their door. Do you think we can see everything from our room? Jeffrey asked. One way to find out, his dad said. Jeffrey pushed through the door. The world exploded into booms. Jeffrey thought, firecrackers. Then his chest erupted into a ball of heat. He looked down and saw he was soaked in blood. A swarm of faces buzzed over him. Strong arms held him. Knives arced past his face. It hurt more than any schoolyard fight. He struggled and screamed, though all he could hear was the voice of the ghostly man from the tomb saying, You are going to die. His name is Avi Ben Avram, Jeffrey thought. The realization he knew the man's name, that he was certain of it, filled him with a blooming sense of wrong, along with the blinding pain. With the last of his strength, he screamed, not in pain, but from the sense someone was cheating, like someone had jacked up an arcade game instead of letting it play out, only 1,000,000 times worse. He tried to struggle, but found he could not lift his arms. There was so much more of the world to see, and a sense of something dreadfully important he was supposed to do, pushing him to fight. But instead, he knew he was about to die, and then the last of his life left him again. And that's the end of this section.
All right, very good. Thank you, Daniel. All right, so before we go, I just want to say that thank you everyone for reading. They were all excellent. And to the audience, I was wondering if anyone has any questions before we go. Feel free to ask, and I'll get to them. I was playing around with something here, and I can't see trying to get rid of it.
You're back. You were a little muted there for a second.
Comments. There we go. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask now. So thank you for coming along and reading your stories. Does anyone have anything that they want to plug before we go? We'll start with Brenda.
I think she's muted. Oh, there she is.
Oh, there. Just my book, I guess, Blood Mountain, is on pre-order, so you can get that at Raw Dog Screaming Press. And then hopefully a lot of people come out to Stoker Con this May, and I'll be able to meet some people. That'd be awesome. So Lovely reading. Thank you for having me on.
Yes. Thank you for coming. Elana?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It was fabulous. So I have 2 novels coming out later in the year, but in May I have a collection of Gothic fairy tales, strange stories, as Daniel described it, coming out. It's called My Lady of Plagues and Other Gothic Fairy Tales. It's coming out with Weird House Publishing. And it's not about Jewish horror, but it has, I love fairy tales, so it has like my versions of classic fairy tales, some known, some totally unknown. And let me rephrase it, it does have a story called Death in Jerusalem, so it is somewhat connected, but it's also a fairy tale. So if you want to see a horror Jewish Gothic fairy tale set in Jerusalem, you can find it in my collection.
Awesome. And Daniel?
Oh, I do want to see a Gothic horror Jewish fairy tale set in Jerusalem. I think I am your target audience. I'm just such a big fan of fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, especially the dark variety. So I'm looking forward to that book, just as I'm looking forward to Blood Mountain, Brenda's book that's coming out. I guess in terms of plugs, I have a YouTube channel. I think it's just called Daniel Braum as well. I think you can hear Brenda reading a bit of Blood Mountain in one of our events, the New York Ghost Story Festival, and I've forgotten which day, but you can check that out and hear some of Blood Mountain there and connect with my channel. It's the Jewish Book of Horror that I hope you'll have a chance to check out. My most recent book is Underworld Dreams. It does have a Jewish horror story in it, and maybe a connection or two to a Jewish character. But just want to say thank you to the other 2 readers and to our colleagues, and thank you to you, Jason. Thanks so much.
Oh, no problem. Actually, if it wasn't for you, Dan, this probably wouldn't have happened. But I just want to show the cover for Elana's little sister, because it's a really neat kind of cover there. I have the ebooks from my Kindle.
Isn't it gorgeous?
Yeah, I love it. And also, she has another book that I bought called Cryptids. The Cryptid, sorry, and that's right here. Hang on, I just want to pull up the cover. Of course, we start on page 1, and the cover is way in the back. There we go.
Thank you.
And I didn't get. I don't have your book yet, Brenda, but I'm definitely going to get it. And Dan, if it wasn't for you, this wouldn't have gone as well as it did. You did a lot of the back work, and I totally appreciate that. It was your idea too, so thank you, Daniel.
Very welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions. So thanks everyone. I'm gonna end the broadcast now, and you're all welcome to come back anytime. Just you have my email, you have my messenger on Facebook. Just contact me, and we'll hook it up.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Good job, everyone.
And thanks to everyone who came out and talked with us. It was a great time.
Thank you.